incredible.
Another example of that yesterday, which we'll talk about later, but Elaine Chao, who of course is in the president's cabinet.
Oh my gosh.
Provided him cover after Charlottesville, stood by his side as he was defending neo-Nazis. She stood by his side as he was defending white supremacists.
Yeah.
She stood by his side while he was defending the indefensible. She has figured out a way to funnel tens of millions of dollars to her husband's state.
Is that legal?
For projects as he runs for re-election. It's about the swampiest thing I've ever heard in my life. And in other years, in other decades, and in other administrations, she would be fired at once. And yes, she would be investigated. It certainly sounds, if not illegal, extraordinarily questionable, and let's just say swampy. But Willie Geist, we talked about the states where Donald Trump was getting hammered in. Again, this is not fake news. This is his own pollster, Tony Fabrizio. And yes, of course, that included Michigan and I think Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. It also included the Republic of Texas.
That's right. Well, those head-to-head polls that showed Joe Biden beating him might have had something to do with why President Trump is so worried about Biden. This isn't terribly surprising. If you talk to anybody around the White House for weeks and months, he's most worried about Joe Biden as a primary opponent in the race to become president. But the fact that he doesn't care particularly about the re-election campaign, this New York Times piece paints a guy in President Trump who's distracted in meetings and doesn't want to know exactly what's happening, doesn't want to hear about polls that may reflect poorly on him. Also, the piece says he's not particularly interested in what he would do if he won, in an agenda for the second term. So it leaves you wondering what exactly he is interested in, what exactly is he focused on, and that's the fight of the moment. The piece also talks about him being concerned that he hasn't delivered on his border wall. I think that's probably why you see him lashing out, threatening tariffs against Mexico to show to those voters that he is being tough, that he is working on delivering on those immigration promises. And also, according to people who are familiar with those meetings that are in the New York Times piece, when it came to the campaign, Trump's main focus was on his own approval numbers. Surprise, surprise. The Times reports Trump rarely, if ever, speaks to aides about what he hopes to accomplish with what would be a hard-won second term. His interest is entirely in the present and mostly on the crisis of the moment. As I said, Trump has reportedly shown no interest in formulating a new message even for his campaign, instead continuing with his Make America Great Again slogan from his last race and adding that he also wants to keep America great. Trump insists on having final approval over the songs on his campaign playlist, as well as the campaign merchandise. But according to the Times, he has never asked to see a budget for 2019. Now, Nick, David Axelrod is quoted in the piece as saying Barack Obama was focused on the business of the country. He wasn't engaged yet in the campaign at this point either. But the President of the United States doesn't appear particularly engaged in what's in front of him either. Forget the campaign, but what's in front of him, or even if he won a second term, what the big goals might be.
I mean, look, I can see the argument for not being too much in the weeds with the day-to-day operational details of your campaign. It can actually hurt you as a candidate. But this is a president who often seems distant from his own administration. He's distant from his own campaign. So what does he care about? And what's he doing every day? And why is he there? We see him tweeting a lot. We see him watching a lot of cable news. Not there's anything wrong with that. And I think it's important for him to figure out exactly why he's there and what fight he wants to wage. It often does seem like he relishes the combat of it. The approval ratings are the one thing that in that story that jumped out, that he cares about how much people like him.
Well, his staff clearly doesn't like him very much. Can you imagine
the details of this piece?
The details of this piece, if this had been about President Obama or President Bush, the disloyalty is running rampant in this. And it's just this story is yet another reminder.
Yeah, but you know, we can overthink this. I have an answer to your question. What does he care about? He cares about himself. That's all he cares about himself. And every day is just an extension of a show that he has with set-up villains. In case it's either Joe Biden or it's the Mexican government, whatever. But Gene, I'm wondering if in Washington more people realize that this is just a daily show, that the president is obsessed with himself, not the country, not any formulation of plans to improve the country, not his goals for his administration's first term, or certainly not what would be a second term set of goals. It's himself.
Well, this is not a big revelation to people in Washington, people including Republicans who have been paying attention. This is what Donald Trump has been from day one. He's been, he runs the country the way he ran the Trump Organization, which in his description is he just wake up in the morning and sort of take it from there. He sort of ad-lib his way through an episode of the Trump Show, and that's what he's doing with the country. That's why nobody in his administration, including his press office, has the slightest idea of what's coming out in the next tweet, what the policy change will be, where we will be headed, tariffs, no tariffs, China, Mexico. Where are we going? And has always been all about Donald Trump. I think people here understand that very well. My question is whether people in the country, people who put their hopes and aspirations in Donald Trump, begin to understand that really he's about himself, he's not about them.
No, they actually, Mika, they haven't figured that out yet. I think they will during the campaign. I think a lot of Americans
But we're not there yet.
will
And we
during
may not
the
get
campaign. It's just so important to remember again, as everybody's saying, Donald Trump lives in the moment. And that has worked because up until now, he's figured out how to keep everybody off balance with a crazy tweet here, a crazy statement there, constantly trying to keep them off balance. A trade war with China, that starts to resolve itself, so he starts a trade war with Mexico.
Yeah.
The markets rebel against him. He knows he can't have a weak stock market. So what does he do? He makes up a fake agreement, secret agreement, which we find out, the Mexicans said last night, no, there was never a secret agreement. So now he's moving back to fighting China. Well, people are going to catch on, and when suddenly your 4 years can be reduced to 30-second ads, those 30-second ads are going to be devastating against Donald Trump, and he's not going to be able to tweet his way out of that corner.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, President Trump says that deal with Mexico is fully signed. Mexico, as Joe mentioned, says, what is he talking about? That's incredible, and we'll break that down. And as Joe mentioned, for the second time in as many weeks, Elaine Chao is in the headlines. The Trump cabinet secretary happens to be married to Mitch McConnell, whose home state of Kentucky is reaping some massive rewards.
Because of her.
We'll explain that just ahead. But
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.